Welcome back to another edition of the MintCast, the podcast from Mint Press News. I'm your host today, Alan McLeod. Now, there are few billionaires more famous or more influential than a certain William Gates, who uses his money to advance his interests. Bill Gates in popular media is often presented as a lovable geek trying to save the world and push his pet projects, a philanthropist trying to save the planet and save society. But frankly, under the surface, that superficial view really masks an image of a much more powerful and much more nefarious man. Our guest today is Tim Schwab, an investigative journalist based in Washington, D.C. Tim has written for quite a number of outlets, including The Nation, the Columbia Journalism Review, Baffler and Jacobin magazine, and he is the author of the new book, The Bill Gates Problem, Reckoning with the Myth of a Good Billionaire, that was just published by Macmillan in November. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
No, the pleasure's all mine. So I guess the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is Bill Gates and COVID-19, because he really seemed to peak his notoriety anyway, peaked during that pandemic where he seemed to become this sort of go-to world expert on the virus, something that surprised a lot of people given his background in founding Microsoft and pushing Microsoft products into everybody's houses, actually. This led to all manner of weird conspiracy theories coming about what he was doing. And unfortunately, many of them overshadowed the very harmful actions that Gates took that caused considerable suffering around the world. One in particular was when Gates pressured Oxford University to essentially privatize their publicly funded COVID vaccine. Oxford had announced that its COVID vaccine would be open source and that any and all pharmaceutical companies could produce it for a very small price themselves, perhaps $2, $3, $4. And yet Gates was able to stop all this. Could you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, it was interesting timing. I published my very first article on the Gates Foundation in March of 2020, which was right as COVID was happening. And it was kind of a strange time because in the months and years that followed, Gates was everywhere. He was on TV playing expert on public health, sitting next to Anthony Fauci. He was behind the scenes, behind closed doors at decision-making tables, helping organize a pandemic response. So this was absolutely, I think, the zenith of Bill Gates' philanthropic career. He had been working through the foundation on vaccines and public health for decades. It became pretty clear very early that we would need a vaccine. That would be the strategy we would take to solve the pandemic, and Bill Gates was the vaccine guy. And, he went out into the world and said, I have relationships with governments. I have relationships with pharmaceutical companies. I have a relationship with the WHO. I really need to be at the center of this pandemic response, certainly as it concerns the poorest people on earth. And what Gates promised was that his partnerships with the pharmaceutical industry would deliver vaccine equity, that the poorest people on earth would not be sent to the back of the line. But we found quite the opposite happened, that Gates' plan failed. It presided instead over what became known as vaccine apartheid. So all of Gates' charitable interventions and humanitarian procurement projects and his relationships with the pharmaceutical industry didn't change the logic of the marketplace, which was these pharmaceutical companies would want to sell to the richest bidders in the highest countries, and the poor would be left out. So it really was, in many ways, I think, the ultimate referendum on Bill Gates' philanthropic career, what he can accomplish when he has all of the power and all the cards, not all the power and all the cards, but when he's put in such a position of responsibility and that he failed on that. So I think that's really a teachable moment to say, when the next pandemic comes, we probably shouldn't listen to Gates. On the specific question of Oxford, I mean, one thing I found in this book, it's really stunning the level of influence that the Gates Foundation has in private pharmaceutical markets, where today the foundation is donating money to private pharmaceutical companies. It's starting new companies. It's sitting on the boards of directors of pharmaceutical companies. It's taking equities, shareholding positions in pharmaceutical companies. And so this gives it a great deal of leverage and influence over how entire fields of research and development can proceed. And the Gates Foundation had a longstanding relationship with Oxford University. This positioned Gates to go in and have this conversation and say, you're an academic institution. The way the world works, it's the large multinational companies that have the wherewithal, the marketing ability, the sophistication to get these vaccines across the finish line and into the arms of people. And he told, to your point, he told Oxford that they really should partner up with a large pharmaceutical company. Now, Gates might not have been the only one, or might not have been the single-handed, bringing down the hammer to force Oxford to do that. But certainly Gates, in a press release, let slip that he had pushed Oxford to go in that direction, and they did. They ended up partnering with AstraZeneca, and what we saw was a business as usual model, where you have large pharmaceutical companies that have a monopoly patent or monopoly control over how the vaccine would be produced, who would produce it, at what price, at what supply, and who got access to it. And I guess the important counterfactual here is to consider there was an alternative on the table, which was this idea of a people's vaccine. You had 4 nations around the world petitioning the World Trade Organization saying we should be waiving the patents. We should make sure that every capable manufacturing facility in the world is turning out as many vaccines as quickly as possible. So Gates really became one of the most vocal and visible opponents of that. The world, we ended up following the model, business as usual model of big pharma, of Bill Gates, and it didn't work. So I think that really is a great place to start this conversation about what the Gates Foundation is and what it's doing.
Yeah, sure. And of course, and not long after the Gates Foundation Oxford University did partner with AstraZeneca. The latter did announce that it was going to be tens of millions of vaccines short because it couldn't actually produce the vaccines that it had promised, which basically meant that tens of millions of people went without a vaccine for a very long time. And in fact, that very long time, because of what you said about vaccine apartheid, led to a very ironic situation where there were people in the global north who had a glut of vaccines ready for them, but there was a lot of skepticism of it. And yet people in the global south were desperate for these vaccines, but couldn't actually get them. So it was one of the very strange ironies, and one of the worst things about all the death that happened there, that, Gates was actually involved in this. And of course, when you said that the Gates Foundation has a relationship with Oxford University, what you're really saying is they have funded millions upon millions of pounds of research at that institution. And that was specifically why Gates could get on the phone and talk to the people at the top of that university and actually sway them. If me and you tried to do that, they wouldn't even take our call. But suddenly, if Bill Gates gets on the phone, not only do they listen, they actually have to start thinking about the financial implications of saying no to somebody as rich and powerful as him. Sticking with COVID-19, there was a lot of praise and criticism of the World Health Organization during that pandemic. But one thing I was pretty much completely unaware of until reading it in your book is to the extent to which Gates has hollowed out the WHO's functions. I'll read you a short paragraph from your book, and I'd like you to comment on it. Here it goes. One reason that the WHO didn't have the expertise or capacity to manage the pandemic is that its authority had been eroded by the rise of the Gates Foundation. Gates has far more money than the WHO and has taken over key functions of its work. The foundation has also become the second largest funder of the WHO, which allowed it to shape what the organization worked on and what it didn't. Could you expand on that for us, please? What sort of influence does Gates have over one of the most important health bodies in the world?
Yeah, so the World Health Organization, it's part of the United Nations. It's organized in a democratic manner where you have member states and you have voting, but you also have this private influence from people like, from organizations like the Gates Foundation, which is donating billions of dollars to the WHO. And the Gates Foundation, much of the work of the foundation is on this issue of public health for poor people, this sometimes called global health, which is the same work that the WHO does. So, but the rise of the Gates Foundation in some respects has eroded the primacy of the WHO in this field because for the reasons we just discussed. Gates has more money than WHO. Gates is funding the WHO. So, there's a couple anecdotes I could share. As far back as I think 2007, the head of the WHO's malaria program issued an internal memo, which was leaked to the press, which talked about the Gates Foundation's far-reaching financial influence over malaria research. And he was saying that this was having the effect of stifling independent perspectives and it had potentially dangerous consequences on policymaking in the WHO. And so this is a very highly credible, source. This is somebody inside the WHO, essentially talking about this idea of the Gates Foundation having almost monopolistic influence, where they have so much money. If Bill Gates plants his flags and decides he knows how to solve a problem, how to tackle malaria, he really can, very quickly start funding anyone and everyone and have a very large voice in how that field develops. Um, Another anecdote I could give is this issue of health metrics. It's kind of a wonky topic, but it's this idea that in many of the poorest nations on earth, people die without a medical record or an autopsy. So we don't know why they died. So we have to create estimates to try and get an idea. And the reason we need estimates is because we need to know where people are dying and why so that we can help them. We need to know if the foreign aid budgets that governments spend, the money that the Gates Foundation spends on interventions, are they working? When we targeted malaria in this village, did it lead to fewer deaths and fewer cases of malaria? So historically, that work has been done by the World Health Organization in partnership with member states who provide data to the World Health Organization. And this gives us a landscape of where people are dying and why. Academic research institutes historically have also done some of this work. What the Gates Foundation did about 15 years ago is they started their own health metrics enterprise, put more than $600 million into it, and many scholars and researchers today regard it as having monopolistic power. It's a way that the Gates Foundation has effectively taken over this work from the World Health Organization. And it's a problem because you really want this work to be organized in a public and open manner. It doesn't make sense for the Gates Foundation, which is funding so many public health interventions, to also be able to control the data or the estimates that show whether these interventions are working or not. And this gets to the larger issue maybe here is this idea of epistemic power, of the Gates Foundation's ability to write its own narrative. If it can control the data and control the estimates that show where people are dying and why, it helps tell the bigger story to the world about what's happening in public health, where we should go next, and so on and so forth. So those are two examples of sort of the Gates Foundation's intersection with the World Health Organization. But I do think it is a concern.
Well, I mean, what you're saying to me sounds like it's almost like fundamentally anti-democratic. When we're talking about something like the World Health Organization, that is, as you said, a body of the United Nations, it should be controlled by governments who are elected by their peoples. But in fact, when Gates can kind of march in and sort of start demanding things of that, that really undermines that whole system. And it's the same with academic research, as you're saying, that academia is supposed to work on the grounds that people come up with ideas, they're challenged, and then we come to a scientific consensus. But again, if Gates has just all of this money and he can create his own parallel parallel world of academic research, does that not really challenge these fields down to their absolute fundamentals there?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's, the Gates' funding influence is so well documented and observed that there's this term that academics have coined called the Bill chill to describe this chilling effect where so many researchers are taking funding from Gates or hope to take funding from Gates that they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. They don't want to criticize Gates. They don't want to publish, data or science that might be critical of the Gates Foundation. And I think that's a larger phenomenon you see throughout the Gates Foundation's work, where much of what we know about the foundation or think we know, it comes from the foundation itself, from its massive PR machinery, from the scientific studies it publishes, from the news media that it helps fund. So that's a really important part of the Gates Foundation story, which is what I'm trying to cut through in this book to look beyond this and to look for independent perspectives and see what they're saying.
Yes, and we could almost, in fact, not almost, we could even extend what you were talking about, the Bill chill, to the media as well, where it seems that a lot of journalists really don't want to cover him in any sort of negative light. But we'll get onto that later. I want to go back to the very beginning, actually. The official origin story of Bill Gates often sounds like somebody who is a talented and geeky guy working really hard and starting from scratch to build one of the world's biggest companies and one of the world's greatest products. But the reality, according to your book, The Bill Gates Problem, is quite different, isn't it? You actually tell the story of a boy from one of the Pacific Northwest's most well-connected and well-established families, more or less, you know, fibbing his way to the top, double-crossing his partner, Paul Allen, and being the boss from hell, screaming at his subordinates and more. That's really quite different to what we hear in the mainstream press, isn't it?
Yes, Bill Gates certainly came from a very well off, well to do, well connected family in Seattle. He went to the most elite private school in Seattle, where in the late 1960s they had a computer, a total rarity at that time. And it gave Gates early access to this idea of computer programming, computer technology. So it was a huge advantage for him as the computer revolution started to unfold that he had this early opportunity, this early privilege to interact with computers. Yeah, his father was a corporate lawyer in Seattle who ended up helping Microsoft in many different ways. Bill Gates' mother was a noted, she came from generational wealth and she was a noted philanthropist. Many news accounts have observed that she sat on the board of United Way next to a top executive from IBM. And many people believe that that relationship helped grease the wheels for Microsoft's an early contract that Microsoft got with IBM, which launched it in from a small startup in Seattle into this major multinational company. So this idea of Bill Gates being a self-made man or a self-made billionaire, I think it's definitely a stretch of the imagination. He grew up from a wealthy family. He was destined to be wealthy. Maybe not as wealthy as powerful as he became, but certainly very wealthy and powerful. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other dimension this we can talk about is that I think some people have the idea that we wouldn't have computers without Bill Gates, or we wouldn't have operating systems or word processors or spreadsheets because we use all these products today, Microsoft Windows, Microsoft Word. But Gates is not really known as being a major innovator for his creativity. He's known for being an incredibly aggressive businessman. And you can read the stories of Microsoft's competitors and even Microsoft's employees who will say that the strategy was either to buy out competitors or to bury them. So that's really the legacy of Microsoft and Bill Gates. It's not so much around innovation, but it's arguably around stifling innovation, stifling industry. And we can talk about Gates' second chapter, but at the Gates Foundation, he's brought this same identity around being an innovator. And he staked much of his philanthropic legacy on this idea that he would innovate new commercial products, new pharmaceutical drugs, vaccines, new seeds for agriculture, new educational software that would revolutionize these fields and really have far-reaching positive effects to advance social progress. And if you look at what Gates promised early in his career on that innovation agenda and look at what he actually accomplished, you'll find that in most cases, he hasn't delivered what he said he would. He hasn't delivered anywhere near what he said he would set out to achieve. So I think there's, again, this there's so many mythologies and contradictions that define this story. Once you peel back the layers, the Gates Foundation looks less and less like the common definition of charity.
Yeah, and one of the most shocking parts is really reading about how he double-crossed his partner, Paul Allen. Allen assumed that the business was going to be 50-50, and then Gates simply insisted that he was going to take 60% of the business. And even as Allen was a bit of a pushover and he had and his health got worse, he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He actually heard that Gates was planning to dilute his shares even further. And I think that really shows the sort of predatory nature to Gates that you were talking about in his business sense, but also in his personal life. And of course, when we look back at the history of computers and actually many modern technologies which shape the globe today, so much of it was actually developed at public expense in places like the military or at universities. And it was only really at a time when it suddenly became profitable that it was handed over to the private sector. And that private sector really hasn't innovated very much. When you think about Microsoft products, I've been using them since I was a kid, and I don't think Microsoft Office has changed much in the last few decades, that's for sure. It's pretty much the same thing. And Gates's wealth is really based upon stringent intellectual property laws and the monopolization of an entire industry. Yeah, I want you to speak a little bit more about Gates' stance on these issues and how, despite even himself being sued by the US government for antitrust and monopoly violations, which he lost. Gates and Microsoft just continue to go from strength to strength and became this absolute global behemoth, which without which it's almost impossible to think of the modern office, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, not only would we still have had the computer revolution without Bill Gates and Microsoft, but we might have better and cheaper products. So I think that's part of the mythology and the lore of Bill Gates is what a great innovator he was at Microsoft. But the values and that really drove his work at Microsoft, the neoliberal ideology, especially this idea of the primacy of the private sector, market-based solutions, that commercial products can drive social innovation. Bill Gates believes that the work he did at Microsoft, ushering in the computer revolution, was enormous, was a humanitarian feat that he was able to drive social progress through his work at Microsoft. And so he brings those same values to the Gates Foundation, including this idea about this really a dogma around patents and intellectual property and copyright. So, these, monopoly patents and copyrights were crucial to Microsoft's success, to making it such a valuable company, to making Bill Gates so wealthy. And as Bill Gates sees it, you can't have innovation, or no companies would pursue innovation if they weren't going to be rewarded at the end with a monopoly patent that would allow them to own that software, or for pharmaceuticals, say that drug, for a period of time where they could uniquely control how it was administered, how it was produced. The problem is that Gates brings this dogma to work in public health, where we have a situation where millions of people around the world are dying from diseases that we could prevent or treat if we had access to the drugs and vaccines and diagnostics that we have available. So, Bill Gates acknowledges that there is what he calls a market failure there, but he tries to correct it not through challenging this sort of unethical state of affairs where you have these large pharmaceutical companies who won't make life-saving drugs and vaccines available. Gates tries to correct this through what he calls market-shaping activities. So it's working with and through the pharmaceutical industry to try to do things like buy bulk purchases of drugs or vaccines at a lower price. And of course, when the Gates Foundation is able to get vaccines to the arms of poor people, that is going to help people and that is going to save lives. But he's doing it in a quite an inefficient way, and in a way that creates obstacles to better, alternative solutions, as we saw in the pandemic. Working with the pharmaceutical industry in a patent forward manner. That is one way to resolve this issue about, access to medicines, but it's certainly not the only way, probably not the most efficient way, not the best way. And the real rub here, I guess, is that many of these large charitable projects that the Gates Foundation starts and helps run, they're heavily funded by us taxpayers. So tens of billions of dollars in public funds go into these projects that the Gates Foundation favors or the Gates Foundation runs. So this is a real trigger for accountability for all of us to say, well, is this really the best use of our public funds? Gates has a very narrow, often dogmatic idea about how to solve problems, about the best charitable interventions. It's usually, history has shown, we now have 2 decades of evidence we can point to. It's often the outputs are not particularly impressive. At times, people are getting harmed or injured. So I do think we are ripe for this public debate, and that this issue of tax dollars is a clear trigger for accountability for all of us to step back and say, is this really the best, most prudent use of our money?
Well, Gates is also very interested in other forms of the government, which take up huge amounts of tax as well. I'm thinking about the US education system in particular. Not a lot of people know that Gates is also one of the most influential figures in American public education. In fact, the Associated Press called him the country's biggest champion of charter schools. But charter schools are highly controversial and have seen significant pushback from teachers' unions. If people don't know what they are, they've been uncharitably described as basically privatizing schools and turning them into little businesses. Could you explain what Gates's plan for the US education system is and how influential do you think he is in changing the way we are educating children today?
Yeah, he certainly is very influential. I think his influence really maybe perhaps peaked during the Obama administration because that at that time the sort of neoliberal interventions he brought to the table were so clearly in sync with the Obama administration also. And this is what you see in a lot of the Gates Foundation's work, that it's not as so much him playing puppet master, but just this kind of neoliberal mind meld where he's able to partner with other powerful, especially corporate structures, to work together to build allies and to build a network of power. So yeah, across the Gates Foundation's work, this is something you see again and again, is this idea of the primacy of the private sector. So you pointed out with charter schools, which are, privately run public schools. They've been around for decades. We can now look at the evidence, and there's no evidence that they outperform traditional public schools. So in terms of the amount of energy and money that the Gates Foundation has put into this, the way that Gates has used his bully pulpit to make the world think about charter schools as the solution. It's one of many places where the Gates Foundation made these big bets on these new models that would revolutionize education, that would teach children better, and it hasn't worked. The interesting thing about the Gates Foundation's work in education is that the foundation itself has started to admit its failures. And it came out with this plan to measure and evaluate teachers, effectively saying that teachers didn't know how to do their job, and we don't know how to measure them, who's doing good and who's doing bad. So the foundation created this kind of or engendered a certain name and shame zeitgeist that was trying, under the auspices of holding teachers accountable. It ended up in many places having the effect of really vilifying teachers or reducing the morale of teachers. So yeah, it's at a point, there's a time where Melinda French Gates said that, just because we haven't had the success that we thought doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying. And, I hear that and I say, well, no, that does mean you shouldn't keep trying. Your influence is completely anti-democratic. You're using your wealth to buy influence over public policy, over public education. So it's anti-democratic at the beginning, and number two, it's not working. And the third part of this is it's not just that when these interventions fail that they fail, but there's collateral damage. There are people being hurt. There are teachers who are being told they don't know how to do their job. There are students who are being told that they're not smart because they can't do well on these standardized tests the Gates Foundation's pushing. There are parents who are in this constant state of confusion because Gates is telling them that American education is in crisis and only he can fix it. So they're real. I guess at a point we should stop. We should think less about philanthropy and start thinking more about reparations. Why don't we get to the point where we ask the Gates Foundation to pay to repair all of the harms that the Gates Foundation has caused? And it's not just in public health, but we could talk about or not just in public education, but you could look across the work that the foundation has done. It's just philanthropy is not a substitute for taxation, and we probably should be thinking more along the lines of reparations.
Yeah, I mean, just on the terms of the education system, I can only imagine the irreparable damage to so many young people that sort of system has done when they're trying to force everybody into certain molds, trying to, teach the tests, this sort of thing that really does not do any good for children's long-term development, frankly. So yeah, as you said, reparations could be the answer. Um, Nevertheless, I still think Gates gets a very easy pass in the media. And this whole time we've been talking about the great chasm between the image of Bill Gates and the reality of what he actually represents. And so much of that has to do with the media coverage of him. How has he been able to manipulate the press into presenting the world's richest and potentially most influential or greediest man as a philanthropist? How has that happened?
Um, Bill Gates underwent a really stunning reputation change at the turn of the millennium, where Microsoft at the time was this embattled company accused of monopoly power. Bill Gates put himself unwisely at the center of this spectacle. So at the turn of the millennium, he was being ridiculed on The Simpsons. People were throwing pies in his face. So, by becoming a philanthropist, and I'm not the first person to notice this, it really dramatically changed his reputation from being very greedy to being very generous, from being this cold-hearted monopolist to being this kind-hearted philanthropist. So it wasn't immediate, and the news media was skeptical in those early years about his ambitions and his intentions. But I think incrementally over the years, we've either forgotten about Bill Gates' first chapter or we've forgiven him. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this. One is that he presents such a good hero narrative. This is a guy who made all this money. Now he's giving it all away. Another reason I think are his neoliberal sensibilities and just his general, more politically liberal values, which chime with the values and the sensibility of a lot of news outlets, especially a lot of mainstream legacy news outlets. But another important reason I think, and you've reported on this also, Alan, is that the Gates Foundation is donating money to the news media. So we can't tell the total amount because the Gates Foundation is incredibly non-transparent, but it's certainly over $300 million that the Gates Foundation has given to journalism. And this takes the form of direct donations to newsrooms, funding training for journalists. There are very few mainstream news outlets, at least in the United States, that are totally untouched by the Gates Foundation's funding. It is also true, I think, and many journalists have observed this and written about it, that the news media tends to go soft on the Gates Foundation. Even though there are many, highly credible critics of the Gates Foundation, these are people at fancy institutions with fancy degrees who are writing criticism about the Gates Foundation, who are not funded by the Gates Foundation. These are people who are outside of Gates' sphere of financial influence. Even though there is this robust debate about the Gates Foundation and this robust body of criticism, that those critical voices don't tend to find much purchase in the mainstream discourse, in the mainstream media. And so you have to ask why. And I do think that Gates' funding of the news media has to be one reason. That's my take. You've reported on this. So, Alan, what do you think?
Yeah, you're referencing a 2021 article I wrote for Mint Press News. It's called "Revealed: Documents Show Bill Gates Has Given $319 million to Media Outlets." And that was the first time I came across your work, actually, Tim. And what I found was going through tens of thousands of grants on the database for the Gates Foundation was that, as you said, over $300 million had been directly channeled from the Gates Foundation into media outlets. And the sorts of names on there are really, hair-raising. Just in terms of, I'll give viewers an idea of the sorts of outlets that are taking money from the Gates Foundation. NPR took $25 million. The Guardian, including Guardian.com, $13 million. We've got all of these outlets I'll mention have taken at least $1 million from the Gates Foundation. That's NBC, Le Monde in France, the BBC, CNN, the Daily Telegraph, the Financial Times, the Atlantic magazine, Al Jazeera, there's, PBS. There's just so many examples of Gates directly funding the media. And that's very important right now because journalism is in a state of crisis, specifically because the internet has really kneecapped the advertising model. Specifically, Facebook and Google have taken away so much advertising from media outlets. And so all of these press establishment, journals, newspapers, podcasts, radio shows, TV networks are really scrambling around looking for money. And Gates has been a very wealthy and generous benefactor. But he does, even if he doesn't explicitly ask for something in return, he gets something in return. And Gates, not only that, he has other sorts of ways in which he influences the media. I found out this from your book, The Bill Gates Problem. He's hosted pajama parties for journalists where he brings journalists into his own house overnight. He's exchanged exclusive stories with outlets in exchange for quashing negative reporting of himself. He's even had journalists fired. I'm thinking about the case of William Zachman from PCE magazine. He's funding universities across the world to teach journalism. I'm thinking of universities like Johns Hopkins, University of California, Berkeley, Seattle University. He's also bankrolling all sorts of investigative journalism foundations, to the point where it's now possible to say that individuals can go to a university funded by Bill Gates on a scholarship funded by Bill Gates, get a job at a foundation funded by Bill Gates, and then write about subjects that Gates cares passionately about, like health or education. And all of this is basically unbeknownst to the general public. And the effect of this is really extraordinary. We had an article in The Guardian, which is supposed to be quite an important and critical outlet, unironically called Saint Bill, talking about Bill Gates. Gates also very often inserts certain narratives into big popular culture TV programs. I'm thinking about how the Gates Foundation inserted public service announcements about health into shows like ER and Law and Order SVU, not necessarily saying that those those messages were particularly nefarious or problematic, but the fact that somebody who is rich enough and influential enough to do this and can do it on a whim is really cause for concern, because if Bill Gates can do it, so can so many other billionaires. And that's a real problem for the free flow of information and for democracy at large.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the job of journalism is to challenge power. That is your job. If you aren't doing that, then I don't know if what you're doing is journalism. In the United States, they teach us your job is to afflict the comforted and comfort the afflicted. And if that really is your practice of journalism, then Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation should be among the most investigated, scrutinized, challenged people and institutions in the world, but they aren't. And we know that they aren't because you can set up a Google News alert like I have and see the news that comes out day after day of the Gates Foundation. So, journalists from the Seattle Times to Vox to Columbia Journalism Review to you with Mint have looked at this media bias, and we have to ask why there is this media bias. And I think that Gates funding of journalism is one important reason, maybe not the only reason, but I absolutely think that all journalists should immediately stop taking funding from the Gates Foundation. It's just the potential for bias and the potential for losing your independence and your integrity is too great. It destroys or erodes public trust in the independence and integrity of your reporting. I just think it's a bad practice to be taking funding from the Gates Foundation at this point.
Yeah, a case in times of that is Bill Gates's local paper, the Seattle Times. Back in the day, up until the early 2010s, they were really very critical of Gates. They were really looking into what his function is, what his role is, what his actions were. And like you said, they were scrutinizing power. So, for example, there was one article in 2011 that talked about the Bill Gates Foundation, and they wrote that the foundation's grants to media organizations raise obvious conflict of interest questions. How can reporting be unbiased when a major player holds the purse strings? That's what Seattle Times wrote in 2011. But that was before the newspaper accepted Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation money to fund its whole education lab section. And since then, we've seen far less critical reporting of Gates in the Seattle Times. And I don't think that that is a coincidence.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to me. The Seattle Times has not covered my book. My book has been widely covered by international media. You would think that the Seattle Times would have the best reporters on the Gates Foundation, the most aggressive reporters, because they're local. They have the context, they have the network. Clearly, people are interested in the book that I'm writing because other outlets not funded by Gates are covering the book. I mean, I don't want to be too hard on the Seattle Times. I don't know that much about its work. I do think that it's possible to take funding from the Gates Foundation and still do good critical reporting. But I think it's very, very difficult, and it's going to be more of the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, you try not to bite the hand that feeds you, certainly in media when there's so few hands going around feeding you. Yeah, I mean, I guess you also, throughout the book, you're really grappling with this question whether Gates is meddling in all these fields when it comes to education, to health, to whatever, to science. Uh, is it causing more harm than good? And what is your conclusion on that? Could you go into more detail for us? What did you find out, and what ultimately where did you come on that question?
I mean, this kind of a perennial question that critics and observers have asked of the Gates Foundation. because people who have really looked at the Gates Foundation understand that it is a much more complex organization than this sort of altruistic, unimpeachable humanitarian body. That it's not just donating money, that it's also buying influence. But the question is always, well, is it doing more harm than good? And I do think it is doing more harm than good. I quote experts and others who know the Gates Foundation well, who have come to the same conclusion. I mean, one way we could look at this is through the Gates Foundation's work in agricultural development. So the foundation has spent close to 2 decades on this work, billions of dollars. Bill Gates promised a green revolution in African agriculture, that he was going to cut hunger in half, he was going to double yields, he was going to dramatically increase farmer incomes. But at this point, these decades later, you have independent researchers and scholars, people who aren't funded by Gates, and those people do exist, who have looked at the data, and they have shown that the revolution did not arrive. And not only did the revolution not arrive, but in some of these areas where the Gates Foundation wanted to see progress, we're actually going backwards. So, you have independent research saying that the Gates Foundation isn't working, that their interventions aren't working. But then most stunning is that you have farmer organizations across the African continent, which are now petitioning the Gates Foundation, asking the foundation to stop its charitable crusade because it's causing so much harm. The Gates model of agricultural development is about industrialization. It's about trying to make small African farms look like big American farms. It's about agrochemicals and chemical fertilizers and new high-tech seeds. And there were experts at the beginning of this intervention who were saying this model would not work in the model of African farmer where you're trying to impose it, and indeed it didn't work. And what farmer groups across Africa today are saying is that there are other alternative pathways that we should be pursuing. But when Bill Gates arrives with his money and his celebrity, and he can meet with government leaders, and he can sway government priorities and sway government spending, even in poor nations, this puts agricultural development on the wrong track, and that it's time to get off that track. If you're a philanthropist and your own intended beneficiaries are asking you to stop doing your work because it's causing so much harm, that's a pretty serious indictment. And a normal person, I think, would listen. But Bill Gates, he's really, and this really shows his hubris, he's just doubled down on his agricultural development portfolio. He really believes that he knows what these people need. He has the right answer. He has the best answer. And it's his money, his talent, his smarts, his charitable mission, that privileges him and entitles him to solve other people's problems. So, I mean, that's one way. I mean, you could look again at public education or public health. But I think in across the board, if you look at the Gates Foundation and you look at, a question of whether it's doing more good or harm, I think on the whole, it's doing more harm. And I think the world would be better without the Gates Foundation. The world would be better if Bill Gates paid his fair share in taxes. If Microsoft was forced to pay its fair share in taxes, to me, that would be a better world.
Mm. And of course, Gates is now, I think he is the largest landowner in the United States, isn't he, with over 250,000 acres to his name?
I think he's the largest farmland owner. Yes, so this isn't related to his work at the foundation. Just as a private billionaire, he's become this massive owner of farmland. I mean, he has so much money. Today, his personal fortune is $120 billion. He's become phenomenally richer during his tenure as a philanthropist. The story he tells is he's giving away all of his money, but he seems to spend a lot of energy on wealth accumulation. At the same time, he also controls the $67 billion Gates Foundation. So between these two funds, he's controlling somewhere around $200 billion. I think we have to ask, is the world served by having that kind of concentrated wealth?
Yeah, I think this is a question that, it's much more generalizable than just Bill Gates. I mean, the problem of billionaire philanthropy more generally is something we should all be thinking about. Billionaires are allowed to present themselves as extraordinarily generous individuals, even as their wealth, almost all of them, their wealth never seems to decrease, but actually goes up. Moreover, the financial clout that these people have gives them just huge power over the direction of groups they fund and the area in question more generally. And so what I'm asking is, what do you think about billionaire philanthropy? Does that do more harm than good as well?
I mean, the way it's practiced by someone like Bill Gates, I think it does more harm than good. What I argue in the book is that Bill Gates himself is the single biggest beneficiary of the Gates Foundation. So he gets all kinds of acclaim, awards, applause, media attention, reputation reformation. He also gets major tax benefits. The US tax code, it really privileges billionaire philanthropy. Someone like Bill Gates has personally avoided billions of dollars in taxes through philanthropy. And then, of course, he gets political power. He gets to buy a seat at the Democratic decision making table to reorganize public education in the United States or public health in places like sub Saharan Africa. Um, but to your point, I wrote this book about Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, but it is a case study for this bigger problem of extreme wealth. When you allow someone to become this obscenely wealthy, this is more money than Bill Gates could spend on himself. This is more money that he needs. You know that they will use this money for political purposes. If not campaign contributions, if not lobbying, then as Bill Gates shows us through philanthropy. And hundreds of other multi-billionaires have already announced that they intend to follow Bill Gates' footsteps into philanthropy. And this presents us with a political future in which Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg are deciding how to regulate artificial intelligence. How do we fight climate change? How do we fix public health and public education? So, that's not a world that I want to live in. So I think the important thing is, this idea of, we need to address the Bill Gates problem now, not later.
Most definitely. It seems that this problem of billionaire philanthropy is allowing governments to remove basic social services and place them in the hands of plutocrats and oligarchs like Gates or whomever he chooses to put in his stead. And often people like Gates have very specific ideas about how the world should function. They've got very specific interests and disinterests. Very often, these billionaires care more about subjects that affect them and don't care too much about issues that affect ordinary or poor people, like homelessness in the United States or measles or tuberculosis in the global south. And yeah, I think we have to go beyond this. Just in my own experience, I know people who work in the theater, and they say that they actually have real problems putting on any kind of theater that actually challenges people or is a little bit avant-garde because they're septuagenarian rich funders who actually fund the theater are not interested in that kind of thing, and they would revolt if they put on anything like that. And so suddenly the entire field becomes stagnant and very boring, and it's having a really hard and deleterious effect on the theater, for example. I'll steal a line that I read in your book. It's actually quoting from Martin Luther King. The book, once again, if you're just joining us, is The Bill Gates Problem, Reckoning with the Myth of a Good Billionaire. You quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "True compassion is more than just flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, is the world served by allowing a small group of individuals to become so extremely wealthy, while so many people on Earth have so little? And is the solution, to solve this gaping inequality, to allow the super rich to turn their vast wealth into political power through philanthropy, to give away small sums of money they don't need that they could never possibly spend on themselves to advance their own narrow political ideas and ideologies about how to fix the world? I mean, to me, that's not really the world I want to live in. And I think if we take a step back and look beyond the powerful public relations machinery of the Gates Foundation and start to look at what Gates is actually doing, what it said it was going to do, what it's actually accomplished, what the effects are, I think then we'll be in a position to finally have, an open, honest public debate about whether the world is served by the extraordinary wealth we give to someone like Bill Gates or to the Gates Foundation. I mean, these are political problems. We allowed, Microsoft to become so powerful and wealthy. We allowed Bill Gates to become so powerful and wealthy. So these are political decisions we can also unmake, but we have to fight the political fatalism that makes us disbelieve that another world is possible.
Yeah, I think we'd be in a much better position if billionaires just paid their taxes rather than started philanthropic companies, or frankly, if billionaires just didn't exist in the first place. But
Right.
anyway, we're running out of time, and I did want to touch on one subject that we haven't touched on yet, because I think it would be remiss of me not to ask you about a certain friend of Mr. William H. Gates. I can already hear people in the YouTube comments saying that I'm too afraid to touch on the subject, but Jeffrey Epstein, what was Gates' relationship with the disgraced child trafficker?
So Jeffrey Epstein is dead, so we can't ask him. And Bill Gates has been less than forthcoming about his association. We know that he met with Jeffrey Epstein a number of times. We don't know how many times. We talked earlier about sort of the media going soft on the Gates Foundation, but journalists have actually done a very good job investigating this story about what was Bill Gates' relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. So it's an important story. It's an investigation that should continue. It'll be interesting to see what the next bombshell headline comes out with, but it shouldn't distract us from also examining the behavior of the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates says that he met with Jeffrey Epstein very innocently because he thought he could help him raise money for philanthropy. I think a lot of people question, why would Bill Gates, one of the richest guys in the world, a man sitting on a $120 billion fortune, why would he need Jeffrey Epstein's help raising funds for philanthropy? So it's certainly it's an important thread that we should keep pulling to find out what this relationship is. I think we should also take a step back. The Gates Foundation puts billions of dollars into charitable work related to gender equality and women's empowerment. Does it make sense for it to be such a powerful voice in that field, given this still evolving story about what was Gates' relationship with Epstein, along with the allegations that Bill Gates faces around misconduct towards female subordinates at Microsoft and the Gates Foundation? Gates denies these allegations, but with all these stories circulating, I think one should question about the Gates Foundation's role as funding these areas, among other questions we could ask. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting story. It's one that I go into in some detail in the book. But ultimately, it's Bill Gates who, if he wanted to, he could just open the books and say, these are all the times I met. These are all the people that were present. This is what we discussed. So I don't foresee that coming.
No, I don't think many celebrities or powerful people are being completely open and honest about their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, that's for sure. It does seem that Gates has had a very long one with Epstein. There was an article in a British newspaper from more than 20 years ago talking about how Jeffrey Epstein's wealth comes from Leslie Wexner and his connections to Bill Gates. Gates, of course, in 2011 said on the record about Epstein that, quote, his life is very different and kind of intriguing. Um, and Epstein was, of course, connected to all sorts of people at the top of society, including in the world of science. Um, what I would ask, just as a final follow-up, is a lot of this sort of new information about Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein coming out because it has been leaked by Bill Gates's other half, Melinda French Gates, or is that not the case?
I don't know. I don't have insider knowledge about that. That's certainly been rumors and speculation that as they move towards a divorce, I can't remember, was that late 2019, I think, and all of these stories began to trickle out at that time. Is that just a coincidence? It's hard to know. But I will say it is interesting that Melinda French Gates said that she herself met Jeffrey Epstein and she knew immediately what a monster he was and what a liability I think he was to the Gates Foundation's reputation to be associating with him in any respect. And there's a reporter for the New York Times who said the same thing, that he met Jeffrey Epstein in person and immediately knew something was wrong. So it's just like it's one more problem with Bill Gates' official explanation that they were meeting to discuss philanthropy. These were professional meetings. Everything was above board. It's why in the world would Bill Gates associate himself or his philanthropic work with someone like Jeffrey Epstein? Hard to explain.
Hard to explain indeed. All right, we've been talking with Tim Schwab, the author of The Bill Gates Problem, Reckoning with the Myth of the Good Billionaire. Tim, where can people follow your work if they want to hear more?
I'm still on Twitter, Timothy W. Schwab, and I'm trying to broaden out to the other platforms right now. LinkedIn.
All right, great. Well, if you've made it this far, just let me plug our Patreon page. We would very much appreciate it if you would support us financially on Patreon. You can find a link down below. If you're not in a financial position, you can still support us by leaving us a good review on iTunes or any other podcast platform, or a thumbs up on YouTube or wherever you're watching this, or just sharing it with your friends. But until next week, Tim Schwab, author of The Bill Gates Problem, Reckoning with the Myth of a Good Billionaire, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Alan. Appreciate it.